Okay, everyone. Hey, welcome back to stage number one again here at the inaugural SAE International Urban Ground Mobility Digital Summit. We've had an excellent first 3 hours of our event today, and we're very excited to bring you the final presentation. Last but certainly not least, we've got Kristin here to talk a little bit about, as you can see, cities and gender. Obviously, when our towns and roads and sidewalks are being constructed, uh, they're not always not always constructed or planned with everyone in mind, and we want to take about half an hour today to talk a little bit about how everyone should really be considered when developing the infrastructure of our future. So with that, Kristin, go ahead, take it away. I'll be hanging out in the background in case you need anything.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. This is something that is definitely near and dear to the work that I do, and I'm really excited that SAE is making it a part of the conversation and making it a priority. So a little bit about myself. My name is Kristin Shaw. I am a communications and public involvement coordinator with WSP USA. I am based in Detroit, Michigan, and I recently finished a book, co-authored it with Caitlin Shelby Davis, titled Women Driven Mobility, and worked on that through SAE. So very excited to kind of see all this come together and to be a part of today's presentation. This is just a headshot of me from a couple of years ago, and then also a photo that I think is kind of funny and ironic from me at a job site that just titled Men Only on this kind of work site that I found funny kind of in the process of working on the book. So wanted to include that here. So I wanted to start out with this kind of snapshot of what cities can look like and who they serve. And this is just from a handbook for gender inclusive urban planning and design. So one of the many resources that exists for inclusive cities. And when we're looking at who is in the cities and who they're designed for, it's not a perfect match at all. And with the influx of people moving to urban centers and kind of the changes that we're expecting to see in urban landscapes, it's really important to take into consideration the needs of people that don't look, live, or act like us. And then also folks that maybe aren't living there but are visiting or passing through. They need to be kind of considered in the process as well. And so I'm going to start with a topic that is a little, I guess, maybe unconventional in thinking about transportation, but definitely not unconventional when thinking about safety in cities. And there's a kind of a research practice that's been done with this professor, and it went viral a couple of years ago. And he had asked a group of people, and he's done this multiple times, what do you do on a daily basis to protect yourself from sexual assault? And this is just from kind of one of the things that went viral, I guess, the image. And it definitely does not encapsulate entirely how men and women experience space and places differently. But kind of the ethos of this experiment was that men say, nothing, I don't think about it. Not true for every man, not true for every experience, just kind of through this research process. But women had a laundry list of different things that they do to protect themselves. And so this is just kind of the graphic representation of what some of those things are. And what I did was kind of put some barriers into place to see, when we're thinking about this list of things that I might do or you might do to keep yourself safe in a city, to protect yourself from assault or violence or harassment, if we put in the barrier of, well, what if I don't have a car? If I rely on public transportation to get around, or walking or biking, my list gets shorter. And so we think about how we plan for cities without cars, and we think about what this next iteration of transportation looks like in mobility. When we do remove the vehicle, or we suggest that somebody not use a vehicle, we're removing some of their safety net. And I want to say I'm not here to cheerlead cars as much as I'm just saying we have to think about how cars serve more than just the purpose of getting from point A to point B. And then if we add in another barrier, money. So women don't make as much money as men, kind of across the board. I believe it's 84% of women's income is to male income. And so if we remove things from this list that are financial resources, our economic security, are things that cost money, things that like on here is leaving your lights on at night. If you aren't having a utility bill that you can afford, you're not going to leave your lights on longer. And so again, these barriers are being introduced and then removing the safety. And so if we take one more, which is just time. So one of the largest things that comes up in these studies about gender in cities and the things that we see is that while people of different genders can get from point A to point B in a similar way, it might take one longer than the other. And there's no single answer for why that happens. There's a million. So I think the thing that really stood out to me in this list was I took a different way home. So women others will often change their route because they feel like it's safer. They won't park in the same place over and over. And so that mental work takes time, and it takes time to actually do it. And so if you have the luxury of not thinking about your safety or assault or harassment or anything, as you move through a space, there's a certain privilege associated with that. And so when we're thinking about how we work within the built environment to make it a more equitable and a better experience for everybody, it's very important that we consider the experiences of everybody, and then also what happens when you apply those experiences in the with the lens of these barriers that exist. And so after removing the personal vehicle, money, and then time, the three things that are left, one is eye contact. So don't make it. And if you do make it assertive. And the other is be careful not to drink too much, which I think is just a general, best practice for people. And so we really realize that there's so many different things that aren't available to everybody that are these kind of safety nets and spaces. And what can we do when we're designing these spaces to kind of level that playing field a little bit? So we talk about gender and process kind of separately. So when we pair the planning process and design with gender, especially in research that I've done over the past year, what a lot of it comes down to is who is at the table making the decisions. What do they look like? What is their experience? And through planning, engineering, design, knowing that those are primarily or were primarily male-dominated spaces, it's not surprising that we see so many cities that have these barriers for women, or things that just certainly were not prioritized and are now being adopted and included, which is fantastic. But when we think about the other side of that coin and kind of think about how we're going to get from A to B and include gender along the entire way, it's really important to kind of factor in where does it fit. And so if we start with kind of this as how I see the planning process existing from a human experience standpoint, it starts with the urban experience of the planner. So historically, when these were men with, whatever experiences they would have, they would design and plan around that. And then that contributed to the built environment. And then the human behavior became a reaction. So feeling unsafe or feeling extra safe, or, we all have a city that's our favorite place to be. There's reasons for that. There's something that we identify with in those spaces that we really like. And so what I would like to recommend that we kind of rethink this process to be is starting with human behavior. And so when we think about human behavior and not just our perspectives and our experiences in urban spaces, the built environment should result in being more inclusive. And so when we start with the behavior aspect of it, take that and then apply it to our own experiences and the experiences of the folks that we get to work with. And then let that lead the design, planning, and then hopefully, if done in a really productive way, we'll see it in the built environment in the cities. And I think, when we think about our favorite cities, the planning and the things that we really love about them are very intentional, and you feel that when you're in that space. And so we start thinking about okay, very high level, we're doing planning, we're doing design, engineering. The built environment is kind of this infinite thing. But what does that actually look like in application? And so when we start to take back and think about how are people from different genders or different demographics using a space differently, and then a lot of these on the screen are related specifically to how they move through space. And so we go through how we use transit, how we're getting from point A to point B, and then what are the kind of implications of how we make those decisions. And so if we're taking, residency out of it and we're just concerned about transportation mobility, there's a lot of things that women experience very differently. And again, want to point out it's not women exclusively. It's people across all genders. Data doesn't really reflect more than 2 genders at this point. I think we're getting to a place where we're starting to include more considerations of how gender is represented in data sets. But for the sake of this presentation, it's mostly split between just 2. And so the purposes of the way that women move through cities and men move through cities is traditionally different. And so they're experiencing something totally different times of days. And then also there's generally a couple more stops or a couple more things to consider. And then when you pair that with the numbers that are at the bottom of this screen with how many women are commuting to work on a bike, it's incredibly low. So I think it's around 23% looking at this. So if we're pushing for bike lanes and bike infrastructure and mobility solutions that are all bike related, that's fantastic. But are we actually serving the community that needs the additional resources or needs the additional mobility option to get to work or to get home from work safely? When we look at vehicle ownership, we look at driver's licenses, the numbers are highly skewed towards men. And then when you look at the number of miles of women driving, they're actually driving more often. And so there's a lot of disconnects in the way that we plan and who's using these spaces and what we're planning for, and kind of these big ideas like bike infrastructure that are beautiful in theory, but don't necessarily fit yet. And it's a little bit chicken and egg, like if there was better bike infrastructure, would more women use it? Maybe, but we're not there yet. We don't have all of those answers. But I'll show you in a couple slides an image that I think kind of brings that to light a little bit. But one other example that kind of came to light for me that I learned was the seatbelt. And I'm not going to pretend to be a seatbelt expert by any means, but it was designed in the 1960s, and it was designed for, I think, like the 98th percentile man. And women were smaller bodies and different shapes of bodies weren't eventually tested with seatbelts until later. And when we think about the seatbelt, we think safety. We know we put it on, it keeps us safe. And then that's kind of it. It's kind of the seatbelt is a safety, device, period. And when we start to think about for who, then we start to consider how does a seatbelt fit on a pregnant woman? How does it fit on a woman with a small frame? And these things don't apply specifically to women except for pregnancy. But even in those designs, is a vehicle a safe option for a woman? Is a vehicle a safe option for a woman who is expecting? And so kind of thinking about things like that we're looking at every day as assets and as safety items can only be safety items to some people. And so when you take that and you kind of apply it on a much broader scale to transportation decisions and human behavior, you start to see how we actually have to have much more in-depth conversations in order to serve all of these people. And the reality of it is that we aren't going to start tearing down our cities and then rebuilding them from the ground up to provide this level of equity and to plan with women. And so we have to be very creative and adaptive and just modify and continually listen and invest so that as we are making these investments in our cities, that the results just continue to show up. But it does need to be an active effort. And so this is the image I was talking about earlier. So what can we do about this? This image for me, when I've done a ton of searching on women in mobility, just from the book I wrote last year and stock photos. And this is kind of the mood around it. And so I'm not picking on bike lanes by any means, but if you look at this photo, it's just a little unrealistic. It's very unrealistic. If you're going to work and this is how you look, if you get to work and that is still, you got there safely and you still are, dressed and polished and ready for your business day, fantastic. To me, this is something that's not realistic whatsoever, especially living in Michigan, where the weather is kind of the boss. So we think about how women are portrayed in spaces, and we really need to reset our expectations a little bit to think about what we're asking women and then other people who just have either a disability or maybe they're caretaking for a parent or a child, that their needs are so specifically different that without that considered, we're actually just leaving them out of the conversation. And then the flip of that is I like to start with thinking about what we can do to help people, but this is what we have to do. And so from a federal standpoint, from a policy standpoint, we have to take care of our neighbors that look differently, have different needs than us. And so the city should be no exception to that. Our sidewalks, our streets should be no exception to accessibility. We should be considering those needs every step of the way. And then when we're not, we need to recognize that that is discrimination. If we are making it easier or safer or better for some people to experience something, but not others, that's where it becomes a little bit more of an issue of maybe aesthetics in a community or, the nice to haves. And it actually just becomes a problem, a really big problem. And you can break it down a couple different ways. This is one way that I like to kind of think about it is if we're splitting up gender inequities, they kind of go into 6 different buckets. And it's not, this isn't down to an exact science, but I think, if you think about where inequities live, they can fit into one of these. Access leads, I think, always. And so making sure that we have communities that are barrier-free and that people feel comfortable and safe using and being in. Climate resilience is a second one. And so women and certainly communities of color are disproportionately affected by climate impacts, weather disasters, and just will continue to feel that pain first and in different ways than maybe some other either suburban or more developed or more affluent areas. And so providing our residents of our cities with the safety and the security to these changes that are happening and that are coming is critical, especially when we consider that women feel those pains first or harder. Safety. This one comes up, I think, a lot when you're thinking about aesthetics. I put a light bulb here because I think it's probably the easiest and most recognizable thing that can make somebody feel safe in a space. You all know what it looks like to see the glaring street light that's maybe flashing or blinking, and nothing feels safe about that. And but a well-lit area at any time of night, whether it's public or private, whether it's an alley that has adequate lighting or sensor reactive lighting, things like that, whether it's a real danger that's happening or it's somebody carrying some fear with them as they move through a space, as long as we can, continue to promote kind of against that and make people feel welcome and safe in these spaces, we're making sure that more people can enjoy them in a similar way. Health and hygiene. This is something that I think gets overlooked, maybe because it's a little uncomfortable to talk about for some people, or it's actually just forgotten. Certainly, mothers and women have very different needs for public restrooms than men do. The amount of time needed between a bathroom trip and the distance is actually pretty important, especially if you have a child with you, which certainly is not women only, but there's health benefits to that. And so when we think about our public spaces and if a restroom is only open through certain hours, is there lighting? Is there a camera nearby? Does it feel safe for that person to use that? It can totally change their experience in a place. And then additionally, it can really direct whether they're going to have that experience at all. And so the human behavior element of this is it kind of shows up in these spaces where you recognize these things are missing. And then you look around and it's not exactly a diverse group of people standing there. There's reasons for that. There's things and I guess different variables and assets that are missing from that space that create a barrier for people to participate in it. Mobility, again, going back to the strollers, and kind of just the different experiences and different needs of different people. So I like to talk about the stroller because we plan a lot for wheelchairs. And while we absolutely need to, the stroller conversation usually doesn't come up. And when it does, it's kind of a different consideration. And so if you've ever carried a stroller up a flight of stairs, maybe to catch a train or a bus, it's incredibly difficult. It's very dangerous. And you might not have access to the same ramp or elevator that somebody with a wheelchair is using. So maybe you're opting out of using transit altogether. Maybe you are putting yourself at risk by trying to do it. And I think there's a lot of things that go into this mobility space from the gender perspective that you don't recognize it or you don't think about it until you see it or experience yourself. And that's, we'll get into a little bit later about how do we approach these conversations. But that's one of the things that really always stands out for me. And then security of tenure. So when a woman or when anybody's in a new space, they have to kind of look around, get to know it, and become familiar and feel, safe and ready there. If you're constantly moving, if you don't have good job security, if you don't own a home and you're bouncing around a little bit, or maybe even once every 5 years, you have to relearn all of these things in your place. And the more consistent we can be across cities, the easier that becomes for people to adapt to. So this is, again, wheelchair and stroller kind of side by side, very different needs, but want to just list at the top the plan for less and deliver for more. I don't know, every single circumstance where, these two devices might be side by side, but where they are, you can't use one the same way you use the other, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. So even when we look at a policy standpoint, you can get on a streetcar or a bus with a wheelchair, but there's a lot of states and cities that have laws in place where you can't have a stroller open in a transit vehicle. And so while, again, these are taking up about physically the same amount of space and getting on in probably a similar way, that parent or whoever is with the child now has to make the stroller compact and kind of go through a whole extra handful of steps just to participate in this experience, which to me is a setback and a barrier for people participating in using transportation. And so when we think about people using personal vehicles and we say, why don't they just take the bus, or, what if we have this available? We have to remember that there's other factors at play that help guide those decisions. This is a tool. I won't get into all of it kind of here because there's a lot on the screen right now, but this is something that I like to reference as a good tool for how to actually deliver some equity or not deliver equity, but consider it better. And so if you use the gray circle in the middle kind of as your guide for, the 4 things that we can consider, and then the different branches of what those look like, I think doing an audit of your space, your project, your city, maybe how you feel these things are, and just kind of looking and measuring that as an exercise, and then coming back to it later after maybe you work on a project or you deploy something or you have some community conversations, and understanding where things are moving and how they're moving. And obviously, as it becomes more filled out, the more of an equitable space you'll have for more people. And so this is a tool from a report that I was reading from, I believe it's Cities United. And they have a whole report kind of on gender and cities and how to plan for them. And if anybody's interested, I would highly recommend reading it. It's a great resource for considering how we apply these things. So kind of going through how do we actually do this, there's a couple of just key steps that I think are very inherent when we're thinking about our interpersonal relationships, but maybe not in the professional realm. So just acknowledging that there is gendering happening in cities, on sidewalks, in streets, and in places. The investment. So our current investment strategies, are they actually working towards the people who need them the most, or are they kind of just blanket? And certainly the, municipal budgets are not what I do every day, so I can't speak to that. But how can we make our investments more meaningful? And then what can we do as community members to make sure that the people who need them the most are getting them? And then empathy. Empathy is so important in this process. I have on here that women are at the front lines of our cities. Believe them. These experiences are shared globally. And most of the research that I've had the experience of seeing, it doesn't belong to the United States or South America. It doesn't belong to Europe specifically. there's certain places that you can definitely see these trends do not exist. But this experience of women standing on the street is common. And so it's really important to understand that those experiences are real and traumatic, and they definitely drive purchasing decisions, residential decisions, and mobility decisions. And then planning with and not for is something that I have the privilege to try and do in my role every day. And so using active listening, listening to the experts in the community, they know what they are up against every day the best. And so kind of thinking about how do you have those voices at the table when you're actually doing the drawings. And then measuring. So at the end of this process, so measure what you wanted to achieve, set some goals. And if you don't meet them, then maybe go back a step or 2 steps and figure out what's missing. But I think the measurement is really important, because a lot of times we'll deploy a project and then it's done. But how do we go back to it and make sure that it is serving the purpose that we intended it to? And I'm going to close with 2 quotes. So this one is just kind of funny. This was from a project I got to work on over the summer. And I think he was 7, and he had so many questions about a 2-way cycle track. And, having youth at the table to ask these questions. And he explained this very elaborate example of what happens if there's a 2-way cycle track and a sloth crosses. He kept saying, what about the sloths? And I don't believe there's any in Detroit, Michigan. If there are, they're at the zoo, and they're definitely not crossing the bike lanes. But I think that this raised a very, it reaffirmed my faith in just like the engagement process so much, because he was not jaded by reality in any capacity, and just said, what do we do about these sloths and how can we protect them? And I think if we all had a little bit of that mindset of just like, this person, this being might experience this different than me, how can we plan for that? And this was really special to be there for. And then he actually drew out, what he thought it should look like. And, I just want to encourage, when we're having these conversations, don't leave it to just working professionals, children, seniors, people who maybe aren't employed. They have ideas too. And including those at a high volume are how we create places that include people. And then this is a quote that a lot of you are probably familiar with. Jane Jacobs is kind of known as one of the first female urban planners. And this is one of my favorite quotes, just from going through the planning profession. And it's just, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are crafted by everybody. And just really bringing home the intention and the promise that when you have more people at the table creating it, it actually serves more people kind of all together. And so I will kind of close there and take any questions.
Yeah, that was great. And I personally liked seeing the Jane Jacobs quote at the end. I lived in New York for 20 plus years, and she is certainly an icon within the city. So I guess not to play favorites. I don't know if this is putting you on the spot, so feel free to evade it if it is. But are there any particular city or regions that are sort of leading the way right now in terms of inclusivity, or is it still pretty even playing field out there right now?
I think it wouldn't be fair of me to call anything out in the United States just because I haven't seen it all. But from an academic standpoint, Vienna and Melbourne globally both get a lot of love for the work that they've done just in regards to safety and in equity and inclusion. But the other thing that I think the caveat to that is if you match the cities that are safer or more equitable with things like household income and property values, there can be a very strong relationship. And so it's kind of maybe not what is being done well as much as it's how much are we spending as communities and municipalities to make sure that things are done well.
Sure. And I guess, and what are the sort of key differences in terms of cities that are sort of fundamentally laid out differently? Like, so for example, like an urban city with a lot of sidewalks and public transportation, like New York or DC, for example, versus something like LA or Denver or Salt Lake City that are much more reliant on cars.
Sure. So I think the human behavior thing of it is, you know, if you grow up in New York and transit's what you know, it feels safe to you. Just the same way that, you know, me driving a car probably feels safe to me growing up in Detroit. And I think that there's a bit of the unknown, and you hear these stories and you try and look up safety when you make decisions about moving. And the part that will give me goosebumps is that it takes one time to turn somebody off to feel unsafe in those places, and one bad experience, and then kind of undoing that is really important. And so I heard somebody say a while ago, a professional on this, say that we need to do less work looking at camera footage and be more proactive. And I think when you're looking at sprawl and you're looking at cities that have these different systems for transportation and moving around, it's maybe not focused specifically on the mode as much as it's the comfort level, and then how those modes are kind of a part of the story of the place. And so, like, you know, we're in the Motor City, and anything that's not a car, it takes a little bit of an uphill climb to get to, and it shouldn't. But I guess the point to that is, if people demanded a community that had more access to bike lanes, if they said, I need this to live here, or vice versa, if the city said this will make us more competitive for people, for work, for jobs, for school, to just move here and have a family, they can design the city and make those investments in those places. I think in cities like maybe like Denver or LA, it's more, in Detroit, it's fragmented. And so you see pockets of that where communities say this is important here, but it isn't big enough to be a system that people feel safe or feel like it's dependent to use.
I think that's great. All right. Thank you so much for giving us half an hour of your time. This is tremendous. And this is, I think, such a perfect way to wrap up today. For everyone who's watching, thanks for giving us 3.5 hours of your day today. These sessions have all been recorded. Admittedly, they won't be posted next week, but they will be online, hopefully by the end of the year. So you'll be able to review them in perpetuity for your own professional development and career growth. And I want to remind all of you that day number 2 begins tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 o'clock for all the folks over in the UK and Ireland. And our first session of the day tomorrow will be about personal safety apps that reduce risk for active individuals. And then we'll have a number of other sessions tomorrow, also focusing on pedestrian safety and vulnerable road users. So Kristin, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us for day number 1 here at SAE International's Urban Ground Mobility Digital Summit. And we will see you all tomorrow. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Bye, everybody.